The Galactic Council chamber was vast and filled with hundreds of alien delegates, whose voices rose in triumph as the declaration was made that all firearms were to be banned across the stars, and no ship or colony under Council law would be allowed to carry projectile or energy-based guns again, because the Council believed that the cause of war was always the escalation of weaponry, and they claimed that without firearms there would be no more bloodshed on the grand scale of space. Wars and the other species applauded because they thought peace had finally been achieved, and the cycle of endless conflict would now come to an end. But the human delegation sat in silence and exchanged knowing glances, because for them, the ban was not a death sentence. It was an open invitation to become even more dangerous. Captain Ross was one of the few human commanders present that day, and as he listened to the cheers of the aliens who believed they had tamed violence, he could not help but smile to himself because he knew human history too well, and he knew that humanity had always adapted whenever limitations were forced upon them, and if swords were banned, humans had made bows, and if bows were banned, they had created crossbows, and if crossbows were banned, they had turned to explosives and fire, and if all else failed, they used their own fists and their determination, because nothing could strip them of their will to survive, and that was something no council law could ever erase. When Ross returned to his ship, the Iron Will, he gathered his crew and explained what the council had decided, and while some of the younger crew looked worried about entering hostile space without the comfort of rifles or cannons, Ross reassured them that humans had never needed guns to win a fight. They had only needed imagination and courage, and he reminded them that Earth itself was a death world where humans had learned to fight against beasts larger and faster and stronger than them, and had survived using sticks and stones and cunning traps, and they had carved out civilizations, not because they carried the biggest guns, but because they refused to bow down to the dangers around them. And now, the galaxy was about to learn the same lesson. Word of the ban spread quickly across the stars, and soon alien pirates rejoiced because they thought humanity had been weakened more than any other race, since humans were the newest arrivals to galactic space and had relied heavily on their projectile weapons. But pirates underestimated how humans truly thought, because while others surrendered their rifles and cannons, the humans simply locked their workshops and began building anew, and they turned mining tools into makeshift rail launchers. They converted pressurized gas chambers into deadly weapons. They modified chemical supplies into firebombs, and above all, they sharpened their instincts to use anything and everything around them. Ross oversaw his crew as they trained in the cargo bay with spears fashioned from broken pipes, with crossbows built from ship tension cables, with electromagnetic launchers hidden inside what looked like ordinary cargo crates. And as they fought and sparred, he saw the fire in their eyes, and he knew they were not diminished at all, but more dangerous than ever, because now they carried no guns to be detected or seized. Yet they were armed with 1,000 possibilities, and the galaxy would soon discover that, by banning firearms, they had unleashed the creativity of a species that had always turned obstacles into weapons. The first test would come sooner than expected, because as the Iron Will left Council space and moved into a trade route known for pirate ambushes, Ross detected enemy signals closing in fast, and he gave the order for his crew to ready themselves, not with rifles or cannons, but with the new tools of human invention. And as the alien pirate ships surrounded them, broadcasting demands for surrender, Ross simply smiled, because he knew that the Council had thought peace would follow the ban, but instead a storm was about to begin, and at the heart of that storm was humanity. First encounter. The pirate fleet closed in with the arrogance of hunters who believed their prey was already dead, and their ships outnumbered the Iron Will 3-1, while their captains laughed across the comm channels, boasting about how easy it was to rob humans now that the Council had stripped them of their firearms. But inside the human ship, the atmosphere was calm and steady, because Ross had trained his crew for this exact moment, and he gave the command to prepare the improvised weapons that had been hidden from every inspection and every scanner. The aliens expected volleys of plasma fire or desperate retreat, but instead the Iron Will cut its engines and drifted silently as if surrendering, and the pirates moved closer to latch on and board, believing the humans were helpless. But the instant they came into range, the humans revealed what they had been building in secret, as massive coils of magnetic launchers hidden in the cargo bays activated and hurled jagged metal scrap at impossible speed, and the pirate shields, which had been calibrated to block energy weapons failed to deflect the raw kinetic force, and the first raider ship was ripped apart in a storm of twisted metal. The pirates howled in rage and confusion because they could not understand how a ship with no guns could strike with such power, and they rushed forward to overwhelm. But Ross had more surprises waiting because his crew deployed drones that looked like simple repair machines, but each carried pressurized tanks of industrial gas which, when released and ignited, became bursts of fire that engulfed enemy boarding parties before they could even reach the human airlocks, and where the aliens expected terrified defenders. They met humans wielding blades forged from mining saws and crossbows with explosive-tipped bolts that shattered armor with terrifying efficiency. The battle raged and the pirates grew desperate as they tried to adjust their tactics, but every time they thought they understood human weapons they were met with something new. One crewman used a pressurized water hose that had been re-engineered into a weapon strong enough to smash a raider through a wall, while another hurled adhesive foam grenades that glued alien weapons to their own hands before the humans cut them down, and everywhere the sound of human war cries echoed through the halls, drowning out the screams of the invaders. Ross stood at the center of it all, directing his people with the calm focus of a predator who had always known this moment would come. And though sweat covered his brow, his eyes shone with pride because his crew fought like the warriors of ancient Earth tribes who had taken down beasts with nothing but spears and traps and cunning, and now they were proving that in the endless void of space nothing had changed. Humanity still fought like survivors, and survivors always adapted. By the time the last pirate ship realized the battle was lost, half its fleet was burning and the other half had boarded humans, who refused to be victims, and the comm channels that once carried laughter now carried desperate pleas for mercy, and Ross gave the order to cease fire, only when it was clear that every enemy had fled or been destroyed. Then silence filled the bridge and the crew of the Iron Will erupted into cheers. Because they had just shown the galaxy that humans did not need guns to win, they only needed their will and their imagination. News of the battle spread faster than the wreckage drifted, and whispers began to circulate through the galactic trade lanes that the humans had unleashed something terrifying by being stripped of their firearms, because now they fought with weapons that could not be predicted or countered, and pirates who once laughed at human weakness now feared human ingenuity. And in the heart of it all, Ross knew this was only the beginning, because the galaxy had forced humanity to become something new, and it was not peace that would follow, but fear. The toolbox of war. The aftermath of the pirate ambush sent shockwaves across the trade routes, and every surviving raider that limped away carried stories of what they had seen, and though many aliens dismissed the tales at first as exaggerations, the evidence of shattered ships and mutilated crews silenced doubt, and suddenly whispers spread across the galaxy that humans were more dangerous without guns than they had ever been with them. And traders told each other that humans carried strange tools in their ships and that nothing around them was ever safe, because it could always be turned into a weapon. On Earth, the news was celebrated not as a victory but as confirmation of what humanity had always believed, that their strength was not in machines or technology alone, but in the boundless imagination that turned limitations into advantages. And across the colonies, captains and soldiers and even civilians began building their own arsenal of unconventional weapons, and in underground workshops mining lasers became focused cutting cannons. Heavy wrenches were reforged into brutal melee clubs. Chemical supplies were transformed into blinding powders and sticky flames, and every human crew took pride in making their ship into something unique and unpredictable. Captain Ross oversaw training on the Iron Will as his crew drilled with these strange devices, and the cargo bay became a place of invention and discipline. One day he watched as a group tested a sling launcher built from tension cables that hurled jagged shards of asteroid rock with terrifying accuracy. Another day he saw two engineers sparring with reinforced exoskeleton suits that gave them the power to throw an armored alien across the room with nothing but brute human strength. And always, there was the sound of laughter mixed with determination, because the crew understood what others did not. They were not disarmed. They were reborn. The Galactic Council held emergency meetings as reports piled in, and representatives of other species demanded harsher restrictions because they saw humanity's refusal to bow to the firearm ban as a threat to galactic order. But their debates ended in stalemates because no one could decide how to control a species whose very nature was to resist control. And while aliens argued and postured, the humans trained harder and adapted faster. spreading tactics and blueprints in secret networks that reached every corner of their colonies. Not all aliens despised this rise of human creativity, for there were some who admired it, and in quiet conversations certain captains admitted that they would rather fight alongside humans than against them, because humans inspired both fear and awe. They fought like predators, but they also defended one another with a loyalty that few other species could understand, and already smaller nations of the Council were requesting human advisors to train their soldiers, because they believed that if war was inevitable, then they needed the instincts of humanity to survive it. Ross was invited to one such world where he and his crew demonstrated their improvised arsenal before an assembly of alien officers who expected crude chaos, but instead witnessed terrifying precision as humans coordinated slings, electromagnetic coils, incendiary traps, and melee weapons into disciplined maneuvers that overwhelmed traditional defenses. And when the session ended, silence filled the chamber, because the aliens had understood the truth. The ban had not weakened humanity. It had forced them to rediscover something older and more primal and more dangerous. The galaxy had always believed that war was measured by the sophistication of firearms, but now a new equation was being written, and at its heart was the human will to endure and to turn anything into a tool of survival. And as Ross left the alien world, he knew that whispers were becoming warnings, and warnings would soon become legends, and those legends would spread until every corner of the galaxy understood the lesson that humanity was the one species that could never be truly disarmed. The bloody arena, across the outer rim, a warlord named Varen had grown infamous for his cruelty, and he despised the rise of humanity's reputation because it made his own people fear what they did not understand. So he declared that humans were nothing but weak creatures who relied on tricks. And he promised the galaxy that he would prove it by capturing a crew of humans and forcing them into the arena of Korath, where warriors from every species had been broken and shamed. For the entertainment of the crowds, it did not take long for his raiders to ambush a small human transport and drag its crew in chains to the massive stone arena where tens of thousands of aliens gathered to witness the humiliation they had been promised. The humans were stripped of every tool and weapon and thrown into the center of the pit, surrounded by sand and broken metal, while the gates opened to release beasts bred for war creatures with claws like swords and teeth meant to crush bone. And the crowd roared with delight because they believed this would be the end of the human defiance. But the humans did not cower. They looked around the arena with sharp eyes, scanning the ground for scraps of metal, shards of broken cages, and even bones left from past battles. And within moments they had turned those scraps into weapons. One woman tied shards of glass to strips of cloth, making a whip. Another man snapped bones into jagged spears, and a third ripped loose part of a broken cage to use as a shield. And when the beasts charged, the humans did not retreat. They attacked with the precision of predators. The crowd that had expected slaughter fell into stunned silence as the first beast was blinded by a shard driven into its eye, and the second was brought down when humans worked together to trap it in a pit they had dug with their bare hands and covered with sand, while the third was strangled by cords made from shredded banners that the prisoners had pulled down from the walls, and every move was brutal, efficient, and born of the instinct to survive and conquer. Varen snarled in fury and ordered his soldiers to enter the arena and finish the humans. But the warriors who rushed in with shock staves and blades found themselves outmatched as the humans seized their weapons and turned them back with terrifying speed. One alien screamed as his own blade was driven into his chest by a human who fought with cold, calm fury, and another fell when a woman hurled a stolen staff like a spear through his armor, and soon the sand was painted red, not with human blood but with that of the soldiers who had underestimated them. The arena crowd shifted from cheers to fear as they realized they were not watching victims. They were watching predators, and the legend of humanity grew sharper with every blow when the last beast lay dead and the last soldier fell silent. The humans stood in the center of the arena, covered in blood but unbroken, and the silence stretched before one alien voice shouted that they were monsters, and another voice whispered that they were gods. And in that moment, the galaxy realized again that the ban on firearms had not shackled humans, it had unleashed them. Ross heard the story weeks later aboard the Iron Will, when reports reached him that the warlord Varen had been found dead, his own guards too terrified to keep him alive. after what they had witnessed in the arena. And Ross knew that the lesson had spread further than any fleet could carry it, because now the galaxy understood that humans did not need weapons handed to them. They could carve weapons out of the very bones of their enemies, and that was a truth no council law could ever erase. The Council's dilemma. The chambers of the Galactic Council had once been places of certainty and law, where declarations shaped the destiny of hundreds of worlds, but now, the voices that filled the grand hall trembled with unease, for the stories of humanity's defiance spread like wildfire across the stars, and every ambassador carried tales of humans who fought without rifles or cannons, and yet carved victory, from scraps of metal and fire and beasts and even bare hands, and the counselors could no longer ignore the truth, that the ban had not ended. War, it had only created a new kind of warrior, and that warrior was human. Delegates shouted across the hall, demanding action. Some argued that humanity should be expelled from council protection and exiled to their home system, because their unpredictable violence threatened the stability of galactic order. Others argued that if humans were cast aside, they would become enemies, and an enemy that turned everything into a weapon could not be contained. And so the debate spiraled into fear and accusation as each race remembered the bloody tales from the arena of Korath and the destruction of the pirate fleets and the whispers that even allied troops were asking for human trainers. One delegate from the Krevethi stood tall and declared that the humans must be stripped of tools as well as firearms, and that no race should be permitted to supply them with materials that could be used to create weapons. But the chamber erupted in laughter and scorn, because even their own soldiers admitted that humans could make weapons from nothing but dirt and air, and no law could ban thought itself, no edict could erase creativity, and no cage could hold back a species that had built empires on a death world. Captain Ross was summoned to speak before the council, and as he stood in the center of the chamber surrounded by the most powerful leaders in the galaxy, he felt the weight of 1,000 suspicious eyes upon him, but he did not flinch. He raised his voice and told them that humanity did not seek war for the sake of war, but they would never allow themselves to be defenseless, and he reminded them that peace had never come from banning weapons. It had come from balance and trust, and as long as predators lurked in the void, humans would find a way to protect themselves and those who stood with them. Some in the chamber listened, with respect, but others whispered that his words were threats disguised as reason. And so the council split further until one delegate suggested a compromise, that humans be allowed to fight under council banners, only as auxiliaries but never to hold command. But before the proposal could be passed, the chamber was shaken by urgent news. For scouts reported that a great warlord far beyond the rim was gathering fleets and preparing to march upon the council worlds, and the timing could not have been worse. Fear swept through the delegates as they realized their fleets had been designed for orderly battles governed by the logic of firearms and predictable strategies. But the new enemy did not fight with rules and did not fear laws, and so the council was left with a choice: to cling to their pride and face destruction, or to turn to the one species that had already shown they could fight wars without rules and win. Ross said nothing more because he could see the decision forming in their eyes, and he knew that soon humanity would be asked to fight not just for themselves but for the galaxy itself. War without guns. The fleets of the outer warlord swept across the rim like a storm of steel and fire, and the Galactic Council finally understood that their laws and their bans meant nothing to an enemy that had no respect for treaties or rules. For this warlord commanded legions that carried blades forged from moons and siege weapons pulled from broken worlds, and their fury was without restraint. The council armies that faced them faltered quickly because their strategies had been built on the careful balance of energy rifles and plasma cannons. But now they found themselves outmatched by raw brutality, and numbers and fear spread across the stars as world after world fell to the advancing tide. The council met again in desperation, and this time there was no laughter and no argument, for pride was gone and survival alone remained. And it was then that the human delegation led by Captain Ross stepped forward, offering their aid not with promises of fleets of cannons but with the certainty that they could fight this war on their own terms. The council was divided, but necessity crushed hesitation, and so the humans were given command of a desperate mission to slow the advance and buy the galaxy. Time Ross gathered his fleet of human vessels, and every ship was armed, not with traditional guns but with the arsenal of imagination. Mining lasers were mounted to burn through enemy hulls, Cargo containers were reinforced and hurled through space as makeshift battering. Ram's fuel lines were rigged to become rivers of fire that spread across the void, and soldiers trained to fight with slings blades and chemical firebombs stood ready to board enemy vessels with nothing but courage and cunning. The first clash came. In the Kranthus system, where the warlord's fleet descended upon a mining colony, the human ships fell upon them like wolves, and every improvised weapon struck with precision. Asteroid fragments hurled from magnetic coils smashed enemy cruisers apart, while drones disguised as cargo pods latched onto hulls and detonated with chemical fury, leaving burning scars across the void. Boarding teams stormed the enemy ships with nothing but melee blades and exoskeleton suits tearing through warriors who had never faced such savagery, and when the battle ended, the colony was saved and the enemy was broken in confusion. Word of the victory spread through the galaxy, and suddenly the council fleets that had been retreating began to rally, for they saw that the humans had turned desperation into dominance, and soon joint fleets were fighting under human strategies, learning to use the environment as a weapon, redirecting asteroids into enemy supply lines, turning derelict stations into explosive traps, and even poisoning the atmospheres of abandoned worlds to deny them to the warlord's armies. And everywhere the humans led the way. The warlord himself grew enraged as reports poured in that his invincible advance was slowing, and that his ships were being destroyed not by firearms but by stones and fire and ingenuity. And he swore that he would break the humans in open battle and show the galaxy that they were not gods but vermin. Yet the more he struck, the more the humans adapted, turning each defeat into a lesson, and each scrap of wreckage into another weapon. Ross stood on the bridge of the Iron Will, watching the stars burn with the fire of war. And though exhaustion weighed on him, he felt the pride of a man who knew his species had risen to meet the challenge and surpassed it. Humanity had shown the galaxy that laws could not contain them, and that bans could not break them. And now they were not just fighting for themselves, but for every world that still had hope. Left in its sky, the war was far from over. But already the council whispered a new name for the humans. They called them the species that could not be disarmed, the human lesson. The warlord who had swept across the rim now stood at the edge of defeat, yet his pride would not let him retreat. He gathered the remnants of his fleet and forged them into one monstrous armada, swearing that he would crush the humans who had dared to humiliate him, and he declared that he would burn the council worlds until nothing remained, and so the galaxy braced itself for the final battle. A clash that would decide whether law or chaos would rule the stars. The council fleets prepared their lines with hesitation, for though they had seen human victories, they still could not imagine how a force without firearms could withstand the fury of a warlord who commanded ships larger than cities. But Captain Ross stood on the bridge of the Iron Will, his eyes steady as he watched the enemy approach, and he reminded his crew that this was not a battle of weapons but of will. And he told them that everything they had built, everything they had improvised, everything they had endured, had led them here, and that they would not break now, as the armada entered range. The humans unleashed their plan, not a barrage of cannons or rifles, but a storm of creativity. Ross had ordered mining asteroids to be rigged with engines and hurled into the enemy like titanic spears, shattering the formation, while disguised cargo pods unfolded into swarms of drones that sprayed chemical fire across the void. Human ships spilled clouds of metallic shards into space that ripped apart enemy hulls when engines cut through them at high speed, and even disabled freighters were detonated as colossal traps, pulling entire cruisers into their deaths. The enemy pressed forward with relentless fury, yet every strike was turned against them. Corridors aboard captured vessels became mazes of blades and spikes. Boarding actions dissolved into slaughter as humans wielded melee weapons with savage efficiency, and even the simplest tools became instruments of war. A wrench crushed a skull, a length of cable strangled an officer, a shard of broken metal became a spear, and the legend of humanity grew darker with every act of defiance. The warlord himself entered the fray aboard his massive flagship, bristling with siege weapons that spat fire across the stars. He believed that sheer power would erase human ingenuity. But Ross led a daring strike straight into the heart of the beast, guiding the Iron Will and its allies through wreckage fields and traps until they pierced the flagship's defenses. Boarding crews swarmed inside, armed with nothing more than improvised blades, firebombs, and their own determination. The battle inside was chaos, but the humans fought like predators unleashed. And the warlord who had terrified the galaxy was finally dragged from his throne room and brought down by hands that carried no guns, only the iron will of survival. When the flagship burned, the rest of the armada crumbled, morale shattered, and ships fled in every direction, leaving the council fleets victorious. Yet it was not their traditional weapons that had saved them. It was the humans who had shown that a species could take every law, every restriction, every attempt to chain them and turn it into fuel for their strength. The council delegates who once mocked them now bowed their heads in respect and fear. In the aftermath, Ross stood before the council chamber once more, and the silence was absolute as he spoke. He told them that humanity had not fought for glory but for survival, and that they would never again accept chains disguised as peace. He said that no law could erase what humans were, a species born from a world that tried every day to kill them and failed, and a people who turned every obstacle into another weapon. And when he finished, the chamber rose in thunderous applause mixed with unease, for they knew they had witnessed not just allies but the rise of something unstoppable. From that day onward, the galaxy carried a new name for humanity. They were not the race of firearms or machines. They were the species that needed no guns, the species that turned anything into a weapon. And the council knew in their hearts that if ever they tried again to shackle mankind, it would not be law that followed, but fire. The species that could not be disarmed. The galaxy was quiet in the aftermath of the Great War, and the stars themselves seemed to shine differently, as if even they had witnessed what humanity had done. The fleets of the council were scarred. The worlds of the rim still burned, and countless voices mourned, but in every whisper, there was one truth that could not be denied. It had been humanity that turned the tide when all others had faltered. Captain Ross stood aboard the Iron Will looking out at the endless void, and he thought of how far his people had come from being newcomers mocked and underestimated to being the ones the galaxy now spoke of in both reverence and fear. He knew that the council would try again to regulate and restrain, to issue decrees that sought to contain the unpredictable nature of humans. But he also knew such efforts were doomed because humans had shown that the strength of their species was not in the weapons they carried, but in the minds and hearts that could shape anything into survival. On colonies across the stars, children listened to stories of how their ancestors had fought without guns, using nothing but ingenuity and courage, and they grew up not fearing the law of the council, but proud of the legacy that no ban could erase. Soldiers trained in methods that looked like madness to outsiders, wielding tools that seemed ordinary, until battle revealed their hidden power, and traitors carried whispers from system to system that no one should ever mistake the lack of firearms as weakness, because it was in that absence that humanity became most dangerous. The counselors who once celebrated their ban now walked their halls with unease, because they understood they had not ended war, they had given birth to a legend, and that legend was a species that could not be tamed. Commanders from alien armies began requesting human advisors, and even rivals who had once despised them now sought alliances, for they knew that when war returned, as it always did, they would want the humans at their side rather than against them. Ross left the council chambers for the last time, knowing his people had carved their place in history, not as conquerors of law, but as masters of adaptation, and he looked to the stars with a quiet smile, because he knew the truth would echo across every world, across every fleet, across every corner of the galaxy. Humanity could never be disarmed. Humanity could never be silenced. And if the galaxy wished for peace, it would not come through chains, but through respect earned in the fires of survival. And so the story was sealed in the memory of the stars, a story of a species born from struggle, a story of survivors who turned everything into a weapon, a story that ended with a simple truth. Humanity did not need guns to be feared. Humanity did not need permission to endure. Humanity only needed the will to fight and the will to win the end.